Marvel Comics has turned their multiverse into an omniverse. And for those of you guys who have no clue what I'm talking about, I'll catch you up here in a second, but this takes place in the Storm comic. Now, I do have a playlist down in the description so you can get caught up, but the long and short of it is that as of right now, within the Storm comic, there's two conflicts happening at the same time. The first is Mistress Death, and she's basically waging a war against the cosmic entities, the gods, the whole nine yards in the main Marvel universe, because her brother Oblivion was killed in the Thunder War by this storm god named Hadad. Ironically enough, Mistress Death has enslaved Hadad, and now she's going to war. The second thing that happened is in the midst of all of this, Storm was yanked out of the main Marvel universe by this astronaut. We didn't know who she was, and we didn't know what her motivation was. But when she pulled Storm out of the Marvel multiverse, she put her into the DC Comics multiverse, which was nuts. She doesn't stay here overly long, and that's where we pick up here. We pick up at the source wall, which is basically the wall around the entirety of the DC multiverse that separates it from everything else. Historically speaking, in DC Comics, the source wall is what separated everything in the DC Comics multiverse from basically the presence, the god of all creation. What this story is pitching is that it's what separates the DC multiverse from every other multiverse within the Omniverse, which is essentially a collection of multiverses. And you guys will see what I'm talking about here in a second because it gets nuts. And so what had happened was that Storm had taken the helmet off of the astronaut and realized it was her mother from an alternate reality. Now, in the main Marvel universe, Storm's mother died when she was very young, so she basically lived her life never really knowing her mom on a personal level. So in some ways, it is a chance for the two of them to connect in a way that Storm never could, but it's also Storm knowing it's not really her mom. And so that's why the conversation between the two of them is both familiar, but distant at the same time. Because when Nadare wakes up, the response to Storm, right, you are awake. And her mother says, that fish might have been the physical embodiment of gluttony or all fishy smells in this multiverse, and you just killed it for food. And Storm's just kind of like, you know, I did what I had to do, right? And she asks, you are not my mother, are you? And she says, no, right? I am your mother, but I am not the one you know. I'm your mother from a different universe. And so Storm asks, why did you bring me here? And please, no more vague, it's for your own good answers. And her mother tells her, your universe is dying, Aurora. Now, here's the thing. I know some of you guys are gonna be like, oh my God, again, really? Like they're killing the universe? Storm says that. She's like, at what point does this stop being the boy who cried the universe is dying? So you guys are not the only ones who feel that way. I love that Marvel's pointing fun at it. And Storm's like, some being that defies my understanding comes along to tell me that the universe is dying and that I have to fight to save it. In the end, I discover that I'm simply a disposable piece on their cosmic chessboard. In the end, the universe is safe in a way that I am not so sure if it was ever truly in danger, but my body and soul are introduced to new hurts. In the end, I am the one who dies, one piece at a time. And that's what her mother tells her. That's because when you became the host of eternity, your fate became entangled with your universe, and your universe has been dying ever since. Oblivion made death a part of it, and that seed now germinates and spreads across our entire multiverse cluster. Very quickly, all that will be left is the realm of death and the Oblivion Void, like it was at the very beginning before all of creation. Now that's one of the things to know here within Marvel Comics, that Muriwa had introduced this concept that at some point along the line, there was kind of a contest or a battle between Eternity and Oblivion over who would house death, that Eternity would send his champions, his avatars forward to fight Oblivion directly, and Oblivion won every single one of them. It was kind of like a Mortal Kombat, right? Like whoever loses in this contest has to be the one to house death. The Living Tribunal oversaw the whole thing. Oblivion won every single time. And the result was that Eternity was forced to house death. Now, on the surface, this doesn't necessarily seem overly important, but it was actually a big revelation regarding the nature of Mistress Death in Marvel Comics. The reason why is because there's always been this question, can Mistress Death die? And people would always point their finger to the Thanos imperative, the Cancerverse, the story where Marvel and basically the superheroes of Earth in an alternate reality had killed Mistress Death in that reality, so no one could die. But Mistress Death still still existed in the main Marvel Universe. That all seemed to point to the idea that there's one multiversal version of Mistress Death, and every version of her in every reality is just a facsimile of her, right? Her literally spreading herself across the multiverse. And so what we're essentially seeing now in the Storm comic is the one true version of Mistress Death in the multiverse seeking vengeance for the death of her brother. And that's why Nadari talks the way she does. It's our entire multiverse cluster that's dying this time. Notice how she phrases that, multiverse cluster, because the Omniverse is a collection of multiverses. And so when Storm starts crying, she simply just says, I cannot do this. Right? I am hearing my dead mother's voice and I'm seeing her face. And that voice is telling me about the universe, not what I want to hear. This is the most you have spoken to me in ages. And it's about this. Right? Why did you bring me here? And her mother responds and says, in my universe, your father and I were engineers. We created so many brilliant inventions together, but never our own Aurora. So basically, she never had a daughter. And that's really the motivation behind her yanking Storm out of the main Marvel Universe. Now, why do that? Why not just pull Storm from an alternate reality? I don't know, it's the main Marvel Universe. It's where all the stories take place. So it makes the most sense, right? But it is really just kind of, I've always wanted a daughter, and you are the closest thing I would have to one. I've been watching you for a long time. My goal is to keep you alive. But Storm says no, right? She says, you need to take me back to my world. I should be there with them if the universe is indeed dying. I should be there to take care of their little needs while I prepare to face the gargantuan hurdles ahead. And her mother tells her, absolutely not. There is no stopping the war that's killing our multiverse cluster. There is no stopping the betrayals that are coming your way. There is no stopping the secret machinations of your enemies. You will only survive this by giving up on everything that you hold dear, Aurora, which is ominous, right? Because we're seeing like Galacta, the daughter of Galactus, she's been a part of this for a little while, albeit just floating in a tank held by the FBI. How the FBI is able to keep the daughter of Galactus contained, that's something that we have not gotten an answer to yet, which seems kind of crazy. But the bigger point that she's making here, and this is very, very ominous, the War of Mistress Death on the Marvel Universe and the greater multiverse as a whole, because keep in mind, this isn't just one single universe where it's happening. There's no escaping it. There's no overcoming it. And indeed, that seems to be the case. Mistress Death amassing an army of every superhero who has ever died, in addition to anybody who's ever died, and just sending them across all of creation. How do you overcome that? Mistress Death herself is already astronomically powerful. If you live to see the dawn, it's because Mistress Death allows it. She can, and presumably will, outlast everything. We know that from Secret Wars 2015, right? Thanos was technically barred from the realm of Mistress Death, and has been in Marvel Comics for quite some time. And so when Doctor Doom destroyed him, he was shunted off, right, to some place outside of all of creation. He didn't really die, because he couldn't go to the realm of Mistress Death. He was just shot off to the Oblivion Void. But when it came to Doctor Strange, he died. And so seemingly Mistress Death continued on even into the collapse of the multiverse. So how do you defeat something like that? And that's the question that we're waiting on an answer for. But at that point, with Storm being told no by her mother, a fight breaks out between the two of them. But her mother, being an explorer, has transitioned beyond simply just the Marvel multiverse. Now we're in the DC multiverse, and there's multiverses beyond that. Because what ends up happening is her mother tells her, be reasonable, Aurora. Death has an army in the quintillions, if not more. What are you going to do? Fight them all, which is a fool's errand. There's no way Storm could do that. But Storm simply says, yes, I will do what I have to do. And that's the nature of Storm's character, right? She'll take all comers. Against all odds, she will stand her ground. It's why we all love her so much in Marvel Comics. And so her mother just responds and says, I have never met anyone so stubborn. And Storm's like, and I've never met anyone so adamant about giving up. So like any mother and daughter, they're seemingly opposites. And so her mother just asks, right, giving up, let death have your universe. When the dust of war finally settles, we will go back and trigger the creation of a new multiverse. That is not giving up. That's wisdom, which is actually not the worst plan if you're not invested in that particular reality, if you don't have friends there or anything along those lines. But Storm, ever the superhero, raises a good point. While the plan is seemingly sound, let the war happen, let Mistress Death destroy everything there, and then re-jumpstart that universe. Storm asks the question, what if a multiverse of sentient sauropods has already been created before we get back there, right? Which is to say, what if my multiverse, once it's destroyed, has started to recreate itself? right? Do we kill those poor creatures to create a multiverse more like the one that we remember? What if some harm befalls us before we have the chance to recreate the multiverse? What if we recreate it wrongly? And that's what her mother tells her. It's been done with astounding accuracy before, after the Secret Wars. So what this means is that her mother was observing all of that. She watched it all unfold, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, right? When Secret Wars 2015 was happening, the collapse of the multiverse, Dr. Doom forming Battleworld by just grabbing what pieces of the multiverse were left and slapping them together in one universe, her mother was watching it all, right? And as we know, at the end of that story, it was a combined effort to recreate everything, right? That Reed Richards remembered exactly what the multiverse was supposed to look like. The Molecule Man served as the fountain of energy because he had the combined power of all the Beyonders. And Franklin Richards, who had been built up as a universal shaper ever since Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, was the one who gave each universe its form. So literally, he draws on the energy of Molecule Man, forms the universe, and Reed puts that universe where it's supposed to go within the multiverse. And so that's why her mother says, in this multiverse cluster, where we stand, it happens frequently as a natural way of the narrative renewing itself. The entire multiverse collapses and restarts over and over again. So she's talking about Marvel's publication narrative. She's talking about how Marvel occasionally destroys the multiverse and brings it back as a way to, quote unquote, jumpstart interest in the comic book line. It's kind of nuts because now she's talking about things the way the One Above All would, right? The One Above All traditionally represents Marvel decision-making, right? Editors, writers, artists, the whole nine yards. She seemingly exists above the living tribunal or aside the living tribunal. But she says the age-old question of would you know if a 14 billion year old universe was created 14 minutes ago has been answered numerous times. The answer is no. You wouldn't know. Everything will come with its age, lore, and history. And that's where Storm just says lies, and her mother fires back, everything is a lie. So no, I will not take you back to your dangerous universe. You will stay here with me where it's safe. You will stay here with your mother. And so that's when Storm says, I am not going to let everyone perish for a resurrection plan that may go awry. I am not going to stand by while my friends are slaughtered when I could be fighting next to them to prevent their demise. And my real mother would not request otherwise of me, which is an accurate statement, right? Storm's mother, historically speaking, as short-lived as Storm's experience with her was, and as little knowledge as she has, we know a whole lot more. And we know that at the end of the day, Storm's mother would never have told her, if you can escape all this destruction, get out while you can. The reality is she would have said, if you believe it's the right thing to do, then do it, right? Do what your heart tells you. And so her mother fires back, right? Your real mother. And she says, fine, let's see what you would do differently if you were in my shoes. And in that moment, it turns out she had opened a portal behind Storm, the method in which she uses to transition from one multiverse to the next and send Storm flying through it. She goes through the Chaos Womb, which is the home of the Cthulhu mythos, right? The blind idiot god. This is Azathoth. And as soon as she passes through that realm, she ends up traveling into Shibuya, Tokyo, Japan. This is the multiverse cluster of magic and death. Like, she passes through the multiverse of one of the most popular animes and manga in the history of the world. She passes through the multiverse cluster of sentient trash. As I understand it, this is the world of Gachiakuta. I've never seen it or read about it, but apparently it's a pretty popular anime that exists out there. She goes through the desert of 1993, which is the Macho multiverse cluster. This one is clearly a reference to like Rob Liefeld art in the 1990s, which I think is hilarious. All the pockets and the huge gear and the impossibly heavy armor, right? She goes through the multiverse cluster of War and Lovers, which I'm not really sure which one this is. And then she ends up in Earth 61391. Now, this one's referred to as the One Above All's multiverse cluster, but this is in actual reality within Marvel Comics. And in fact, this was introduced in the miniseries I Am Iron Man. We don't really know a whole lot about it, but it was created by Muriwa, the same guy writing this comic. But when she lands here, she comes face to face with her daughter. And this is what her mother was talking about. You have the chance to spend a life with your daughter. Would you be willing to give that up? Now, to specify this and to kind of go into some explanation here, Storm does not have a daughter at the moment within Marvel Comics. This was a concept that was explored in the Hellfire Vigil one-shot comic that was all part of the events leading up to the Fall of X. That was also written by Muriwa. The way that worked was that Storm was trying to get pregnant, and every time she tried, she was unsuccessful. The result was that she started to have this kind of existential crisis, and she was struggling emotionally because she kept telling herself things like she was fighting for a future when she doesn't have a future herself, which is to say, she didn't really have any children. Now, what Muriwa was doing is he was also toying with the idea that Storm would become a host eventually for eternity, which of course, as we know, she does in the initial Storm run. But as part of this, and I wouldn't say to keep her hopes up, but to basically tell her there is a future worth fighting for, Eternity showed her a glimpse of what her future held, which was a daughter. And so it was essentially Muriwa telling us that he would want to give Storm a daughter within Marvel Comics at some point in time. This is the daughter she saw. And so at this point, we transition away from Storm for a second, and we actually go to the bigger picture and the War of Mistress Death. Because one of the other things to know is that while you do have everything going on with Storm, you do have the War of Mistress Death, you also have Akujin. Now, her whole plot thread here is actually relatively small compared to everything else that's going on. The idea was that Storm had faced off against Akujin's master at one point and locked him away in another dimension where he could never escape. The result was that Akujin's kind of amassed her own army, trying to get revenge on Storm. So as you can see, there's a lot happening within the Storm comic. This particular girl here who has the red dress, this is Bogey, right? She is one of the people working alongside Akujin, kind of her sister, for lack of a better word. But the reality here is that what Akujin's trying to do is effectively sneak into Earth, and that means going through any one of the other dimensions in order to pull that off. She's literally been going around the edges trying to figure out a way into the main Marvel Universe. In this particular instance, they had had a conversation about approaching the Greek gods because word had reached their ears that Hera was interested in Wakandan vibranium. And so that's when Bogey shows up here because she says, "Forgive us that we could not make it to your coronation, my queen. I am sure it was a splendid event." And she says, "Remind me, what realm do you hail from again?" And Bogey doesn't really give an answer here. And she's like, we aided you guys in a conflict at some point along the line, which Hera recognizes, but doesn't really give a whole lot of thought to it because the Olympians have been involved in so many conflicts over the years. And so once Bogey introduces herself properly, the two of them start talking. And that's when Bogey makes her pitch because Hera says, "Do not take this as a sample of Olympian hospitality. I would offer you a seat if I could, but the seat has been enchanted for a god's use. And the last thing we want is for you to die before relaying your obviously very important message." Now, she doesn't take Bogey seriously, and that kind of feeds into the arrogance of Greek gods, both within the real world mythos as well as within Marvel Comics. And so Bogey just says Wakanda, and in that moment, Hera's like, "Let me stop you right there, demon. If this has anything to do with Zeus, his infidelities, or yet another bastard that he sired, I no longer hold such interests. Zeus swore off his old ways and has remained faithful to me ever since." Now, there was an instance in Immortal Thor issue number 14 where Zeus did almost break that, and in fact, Muriwa does reference it. We don't have to go super in-depth into that because honestly, it would just derail the conversation, but we will talk about why he's missing because that is important to what's going on here. And so Bogey initially doesn't say anything, and the response of Hera is, "If that's all you have to offer me, I am afraid that your journey here, monster, is cut short." And that's where Bogey just says, "Hephaestus, but your son Hephaestus is the most famed blacksmith in the universe. Even the dwarves of Nidavellir are envious of his skill with metals. What if he had available to him a mountain of magical metal befitting of his skill?" And her response, "We have adamantine. Why would we need Wakanda's vibranium?" Now, as a quick explanation here, adamantine has existed in Marvel Comics since Journey into Mystery Annual number 1, back in 1965. It's appeared in the Incredible Hercules series with 138. It's been around the block. More recently, it's been a major focal point of the Wolverine comics. It was really kind of pitched as like the Olympian version of Uru metal from the Thor mythos, but over time, the stories have changed so that recently it popped up as basically a sentient metal. So think of it as the living manifestation or the living embodiment of the concept of all metal that exists on Earth. Is a little wonky. The real question is, how does it compare against adamantium? It's more durable. More recently, Wolverine tried to hit it with his claws and it shattered his adamantium claws. So yeah, we can cover the Wolverine solo series if you guys are interested. It's pretty dope. It's really cool. It's a whole reworking of the adamantium mythos in Marvel Comics. The point that I'm making here is that when Hera's talking to Bogey, she's basically saying, we have something better than Wakandan vibranium. What do we need you for? And that's when Bogey just says, you don't. Right, but the only thing more insatiable than the infinite hunger of men is the well of desire of the Olympian gods. My master's army requires safe passage through the underworld to Earth. We have a score to settle there with an Aurora Monroe. As payment, you will receive all of the vibranium of Wakanda. And so she's asked by Hera, do you have the vibranium yet? And Bogey says no. And so at that point, Hera asks, then why don't I march the Olympian army down to Earth, take the vibranium myself, instead of giving you passage through the underworld? Well, there's two reasons why you don't do that. The first is when Black Dwarf tried to invade Wakanda during the collapse of the multiverse in Jonathan Hickman's Infinity and Avengers and New Avengers. Yeah, man, he was left with his tail between his legs. That dude was dominated. It really wasn't even close. They had to go back with like a full contingent and take the entire nation. But the second reason why is because of something that happened during Blood Hunt, which is to say, the Ennead and the Orishas had actually come to an alliance, the Egyptian gods and the West African gods, due to the actions of Varney at one point along the line, this vampire god who was trying to seize control of the world. This alliance still holds in the modern era. And so what it would mean is that if Hela and her forces were to launch an attack against Wakanda, they'd end up facing off against both the Egyptian and the West African pantheon of gods and the full armies that they have at their disposals. And that's what she's told. Mortals and monsters may attack without much interference, but an attack from a fellow pantheon of gods will certainly draw the attention of their joint armies. And so she says, would the Olympians wish to wage war against the joint forces of the Ennead and Orishas, or simply give us passage through the underworld? And that is when Hades and Persephone arrive. Now, traditionally, they're the ones that rule the underworld, but in the aftermath of Zeus going missing during the events of Thunder War, having been killed by Hadad, things have basically changed here. What Hades reveals is he says, for eons, the underworld has been the stronghold of Olympus. Every time the realm falls into calamity or a great demise befalls its gods, their souls descend to the underworld so they may be reborn over and over and over again. That's initially what happened to Zeus in Immortal Thor issue number 14, when Thor basically stripped him of his powers, and then Thor went forward with both the powers of Zeus and the power of the Odin Force. Now, of course, Thor himself, quote unquote, died and then was reborn again in Mortal Thor. But the fact is, following that event, Zeus went through the whole underworld process and was reborn again with all of his full might and powers. That took him into Thunder War, where he was killed by Hadad. He simply just hasn't returned yet. And so Hades says, to reward the efforts of my dear wife Persephone and myself for keeping this cycle alive for as long as we have, we were invited to rule Olympus alongside Hera as a triarchy in Zeus's absence. And so that's when Persephone says, you thought to slither past Hades and myself in treachery, only to find us here. The fates have a certain sense of humor, do they not? And so Bogey asks, do we have a deal? Will you give us passage through the underworld so we can invade Earth and destroy Storm? And the answer, no. They say, if you are dangerous enough to conquer Wakanda and take all of its vibranium, then you are far too dangerous to be allowed passage through the underworld, a realm that we rely on for our resurrection, the source of our immense power and fortune. And so because she's shot down, what we end up finding out here is this was not a request. Bogey didn't show up here asking if she could go through the underworld. I mean, technically she did, but it was more ceremonial. It was really more of a demand, if anything, because she says, if a god suddenly descended from the heavens and demanded acts of sacrifice from humans, even humans are not foolish enough to question that god. What are a few cheap muscles to the wrath of a god? But gods and their hubris, they don't know their place. And so in that moment, she goes on the attack and she says, before valor, there was terror. Before light, there was the cold, infinite darkness. And that's when Hera and Hades and Persephone realize she's using dark magic. And she says, before gods, there were demons. And she shatters the glass wall behind Hera, right, that houses this monstrous creature which comes pouring out into everything. But the bigger deal here is it shows that she's more powerful than they are, and that they themselves are being consumed by this very monster. Now, eventually they'll be reborn, but at the very least, it leaves Olympus open, and this is now a gateway for Akujan's forces to enter in to this realm. And so at that point, we switch back to Storm. And this is one of the pacing issues that people have been talking about, where it feels like events come out of nowhere. But it makes a lot more sense if you know where to look. So there is a 5-issue miniseries that came out that's called I Am Iron Man. It came out in 2023, and it's also written by Muriwa. The idea behind it is that the character Tammy, the girl with the guitar, was actually from the future of that reality, who had come back into the past on several occasions and faced off against Iron Man. What you end up learning is that in that universe, there was a solar flare that was erupting, and so Tony Stark did the only thing he could do. He took the city of New York and the people in it, and then put it into a pocket reality, but at the same time, he had a family of his own, who he put further into that reality. Now that leads to Tony Stark being the only person in New York City, and ultimately begins to go mad because the pocket dimension itself had effectively closed down. There was no way to get anybody back, even after the flare had passed. And so when Tammy comes along, Tony realizes he can use her guitar to basically go back in time, because that's how she time travels, and save everybody. But his family cannot be saved because, again, they're too far into the pocket dimension. The result of this is that while everything does get restored, the lack of his family ends up driving Tony Stark to madness. So in the future, he becomes a villain that Tammy faces off against time and time again. That's her character in this comic. And so what seemingly happened here is that when Storm arrived in this reality, she arrived in a reality where Tony Stark has either already been defeated or hasn't quite become the villain yet, or we just don't see him. Whatever the case happens to be, this is the reality from the I Am Iron Man miniseries. And so, number one, that's why she's here, and seemingly that's why the Sentinels are attacking and why Tammy's manifesting these creatures to basically protect Storm. But in the midst of all of that, while all this is happening, these Sentinels say the same thing: surrender the Omega. They say it over and over and over again. All the while, Storm's mom is sitting up there watching the whole event unfold while holding the 5th issue of Storm in her hand. She knows exactly how the story is going to play out. It's very metatextual. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.